So let me introduce you to our experts here tonight. I am joined by Français, who is the lead author of the IPCC, Augustin Landier, professor of economics at HEC Business School and MIT.
Just HEC.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Slight title inflation, it's all the rage today. Gilles Moeg, who is chief economist at AXA Group. Odile Renaud-Bassot, president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Natasha Valla, economist and dean of the Sciences Po School of Management and Innovation, and also president of Banque Postale's Mission Committee. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. So I'd like to kickstart this discussion with you, Français, since the IPCC published a damning report about climate change recently, and its release, of course, coincided with the start of the war in Ukraine, raising concerns that the urgency of climate action could be somewhat eclipsed by the conflict. So I'd like to ask you, is there a risk that one of the first and the main casualties of the war in Ukraine could be climate change?
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for having me on the panel. As you said, the release of the latest installment of the IPCC report coincided with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and a common question that I was being asked by journalists at that time was, aren't you sad that the IPCC report launch was kind of overshadowed by the war in Ukraine? And I was like, well, first, we cannot compare the launch of a scientific report, as important as it might be, with people being murdered in a war. And two, it's the same subject. And we should actually be able to connect these two topics without thinking that they are clashing with one another. And we see very clearly today that obviously the background of this war is also a background of energy geopolitics. And clearly this war is an accelerator of history. Today and tomorrow, the European leaders are meeting in Brussels to decide on the adhesion process of Ukraine and Moldova to the European Union. 6 months ago, who would have thought that we would be discussing a further enlargement of the EU today? And that's the same with energy. And I believe that this war could indeed be an accelerator of history, but also either climate change and the fight against climate change can be a casualty of the war, or the war can also be a catalyst of that change. And I think that we need to say it loud and clear. We wouldn't be in that situation today if we had implemented the energy transition 20 or 30 years ago when the IPCC recommended it. The very reason why we let Vladimir Putin invade Chechnya, Crimea, Donbass, why we let him poison his political opponents, why we let his ally Lukashenko of Belarus hijack European civilian airplanes or basically push thousands of migrants towards the Polish or Lithuanian border, that is because we wanted to remain in good terms with our dealer of oil and gas. And today, the very reason why we are not able to impose further sanctions upon Russia is because we know that we would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we were to deprive ourselves from Russian gas. And so the result of all this is that some countries are now announcing plans to reopen coal plants in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Bulgaria, in Austria, you name them, even in France, this option is now on the table. And what is striking to me is now to hear defense and security specialists on TV basically saying the exact same message as the climate scientists from the IPCC, and this message being that we need to get rid of fossil fuels as soon as possible, because such fossil fuels puts us in a situation of weakness and dependency towards hostile and authoritarian regimes. So the energy transition, if we don't do it for the sake of climate change, at least we ought to do it for the sake of peace and security in Europe, and on top of that, for the purchasing power of the most vulnerable and of the impoverished households in Europe who can no longer afford rising energy prices. We'll see what will happen, but there is clearly a very strong argument in favor of accelerating this energy transition at the European level. But we mustn't lose sight of the long term. And we shouldn't be naive in thinking that Russia today is completely isolated. First, Russia is backed by China, and possibly also by India. With Russia, China, and India, we have the first, third, and fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide. And Russia is also backed by a series of countries producing oil and gas. Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, and a few others. And I think that there is a real risk when it comes to the global cooperation on climate change that there would be a significant divide and that the instruments of the Paris Agreement might be jeopardized. Because you can exclude Russia from the World Cup of football. You can exclude Russia from the Eurovision Song Contest. You cannot exclude Russia from COP27, which shall take place later this year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And therefore, any retreat from the instruments of cooperation on climate change are today the insurance of mutual destruction in the same way that the nuclear bomb was in the 20th century. And here, I think there is a real risk, especially if Russia is seeking political allies in Africa and in Asia by offering them cheap wheat, cheap oil, or cheap gas. And this is the reason why the energy transition in Europe cannot be and shouldn't be limited to Europe, but needs to include emerging and developing countries in Africa and in Asia so that their development trajectories are not locked in a kind of carbon pathway, but that they can envision a low-carbon development pathways. Because if we don't do that right now, and as a matter of urgency, then there is a risk that all the effort that we've put in Europe, in the US, in Japan, or elsewhere in industrialized countries might be annihilated by the high-carbon trajectory of developing and emerging countries. So the real risk is perhaps in the long run, rather than even in the short run.
Thank you, François. Odile Renaud-Bassot, the EBRD is at the forefront of climate finance, and you also believe that the current energy shock could be a catalyst for change. You are currently investing in what you think could be tomorrow's big energy exporting heavyweights. So can you tell us more about your vision and your strategy for the just transition?
No, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate, and I fully agree with what has just been said, that we should not oppose. I mean, and in a way, that's true that the current war and the energy crisis it triggers will be, I think, over time, a strong push, and is already a strong push for developing renewable and so forth. Because when you face such a high price of fossil fuel, of course, I mean, we've been told, and it's true, that the price of renewable has completely dropped and is very competitive and so forth. So it's, in a way, already quite a no-brainer. But with the current price, it's even more true. This being said, in the short term, there are very clearly some trade-off. And the return to coal in some countries and the prolongation of coal and so forth is a reality. And I think there is a big stake now, which is to avoid that it lasts for long and that to have a real push and investment, I mean, dramatic increase in investment in renewable. I think the preoccupation of energy security will push for that, because renewable, you have it on your ground, and I mean, energy security is by definition there. But there are other challenges related to, for example, dependency on China for the solar panel. So, I mean, it's not so easy neither. You have some limitation. We realize now that we are already in a huge dependency to buy any solar panel from China, and the risk is that if that continues, we will be in few years, I mean, in a same sort of relationship with development of renewable than we are in energy, or same kind of issue. So the agenda is absolutely key for us, and what we see that and we are working on emerging countries, which are very much concerned, and they are all looking into that. I think what Europe is doing in terms of CBAM, for example, is a very important driver, because even if in the short term for them it's not so key or a priority and so forth. They see that in terms of competitiveness in the long term, it's important to be able to have green energy and to, otherwise they will be cut off of a number of markets or of finance and so forth. So there are very important drivers, and the policies implemented at the European level, I think, are very important to drive and create incentive for this global action. The issue of just transition is absolutely key at country level, because we are working in countries, a lot of Eastern European countries, very dependent, Western Balkans, Central Asia, very highly dependent on fossil fuel, much more than the average worldwide. And also they have huge capacity in lignite, and in some countries, I mean, it's very, very important in terms of workforce and so forth. In our countries, basically, we have 1 million people working really in coal industry. And so finding ways to accompany and to facilitate the transition, because you have huge, even if the economics and so forth are quite clear, the resistance and vested interest and local blockage are huge, and it's absolutely fundamental in all the strategies that countries implement in the context of the COP Paris Agreement, NDC's long-term strategy and so forth, to include this dimension of just transition. And banks like us can help in developing alternative activities, finding ways to have the local population benefiting from the transition and not being the victim of it. So I think that's very important. The other important element, I think, is just transition at the global level. And there it becomes more complicated. When you see the debate with Sub-Saharan Africa on access to gas, because you have all the developed countries saying, now we are not going to finance fossil fuel in the developing world. And that's very positive. It's seen as they cannot do it at home, but they do it abroad. And in terms of, bringing the giving the capacity to the developing world to grow and in a fair way, I think this is an important dimension to be taken into account. And for a bank like us, what I think is very important is to be able to engage in the country. If we have an approach where we say we are not going to do anything with you on anything fossil, I mean, we are out of the discussion because they are going to talk with Russia, with China, and to develop gas capacity. So I think it's much more relevant to engage with them and to help them to develop a strategy where they have this transition, but with a view of reaching the Paris Agreement objective and so forth. So that's also a dimension of the just transition which I think is quite important.
Thank you. So the transition is necessary, of course, but it comes at a cost, both financial and human. Gilles Moek, a recent study by McKinsey estimates that achieving net zero by 2050 will cost an extra $33.5 trillion US dollars a year. So who will foot the bill, or who will manage the cost of the transition, especially because, as Philippe mentioned, renewables remain expensive, and energy expenditure is already rising, soaring, in fact, in the average basket of the European citizen. So how big is the risk that energy inflation and the cost of the transition could push us towards a social tipping point?
Thank you, Charlotte. And first of all, it's very intimidating to speak as an economist after Darren Acemoglu. I think When Nations Fail came out 10 years ago, I think, this year. And it remains the best economics book of the last 10 years. So respect, sir. Now, I'm going to be the depressing guy. I tend to be the depressing guy. I'm a former central banker. So I look at those things from a very, very narrow angle, which is inflation and interest rates. And if you choose that angle, it's not going to help you to be very cheerful. Okay, so what are we trying to achieve here? We are trying to nudge people to spend more money on clean products and less money on dirty products. Okay, fine. The problem is that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, those clean products tend to be more expensive than the dirty ones. So what's the deus ex machina? Deus ex machina is the government. The government is basically going to tax the dirty products and use the proceeds to subsidize the clean ones. You equalize the prices, and it's cool. People start spending the right stuff. It's fine. The problem is that dynamically it doesn't work. Because dynamically, as people actually respond to this nudge, you've got less and less spending on the dirty stuff, so you've got less and less tax base, and it becomes increasingly complicated for governments to equalize the price and to absorb the shock, to households. So at some point, governments have a choice between running deficits, which is not so great, I'm speaking in front of the next Treasury head here, or just pass the increase in prices to households. So there's a risk that we end up in a sort of constant drift in prices. A risk, not a certainty, because the other deus ex machina is to say there's something great which is called economies of scale or technological progress, and as people spend more and more money on clean stuff, the price of that clean stuff is going to fall on its own, spontaneously, and we won't need to subsidize it, and inflation is not going to rise. The problem is that there is no iron law of economics that tells you that the speed of the decline in the price of those new stuff, of those clean products, is going to be fast enough to get us to a future which is consistent with 1.5 degrees in time. That's our issue. So there's a risk that we end up with an inflation drift. On the other side, you mentioned this, the investment need. Investment, we usually put it in the bucket of cost. It's not really a cost because it also creates wealth, so that's positive. But if we need to invest a lot in this transition on top of what we invest on in general, then you need something to convince people to up their savings. You need to raise the interest rate. So, great, you've got high inflation, possibly, and possibly high interest rates. How do you deal with that? And first question, and see my answer, to central banks. I think they have a key role to play in this transition. It's great that central banks are thinking about greening their monetary policy apparatus, green the collateral rules, and so on and so forth. But the key question for me is, how are you going to respond to this? If there's a drift in inflation, how are you going to treat this? As a supply-side shock, and then you would not actually increase your interest rate, or are you going to treat this as a threat to price stability and respond with a tougher monetary policy? That's a big ask to central banks, but it's a question they will have to answer in the next 10, 15 years. And my last point is on possibly a way to protect ourselves against the worst consequences of a potential rise in interest rates. We know we need to invest, so we need to keep interest rates as low as possible, and we know that some countries will have tremendous trouble doing this. And the EU has showed the way on this, as in many, many things, with the Next Generation EU program. That was a great idea. Let's mutualize our efforts. Let's make sure that the strongest countries can actually help everyone spend the right amount of money on the green transition. But for the time being, what I hear from a lot of politicians in Europe is that it was a one-off. There is not going to be Next Generation EU 2.0. And for the time being, it's an initiative that has remained European, that has not actually progressed through the borders. So if we want to be able to deal with the transition and minimize the impact on purchasing power, minimize the social impact, big question on central banks, and a need for further mutualization. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Gilles, and that's the perfect bridge for Natasha Valla to answer our next question about the key challenges that will need to be overcome to deliver the just transition, and maybe the role the financial sector can play in order to ensure that this happens in an orderly fashion. And going back to my introduction, can you both have growth and decarbonization? That's the big question here, isn't it? And is the financial sector prepared for it?
Well, that's a very good question. I have to admit that being an economist like Gilles, it's very humbling to be speaking in front of Darren here. And that's the million-dollar question, right? Last year, I invited Lord Stern to give the inaugural lecture to my students. For the, students come for their master's degree and they discover the university and you have a, big name. And the questions he got was like, should we not have negative growth? And negative growth has a name in French, is décroissance. It doesn't translate very well. But he was very extremely positive in saying, look, we will have to finance all of this. And if we stop, consuming, if we stop working, if we stop investing, that's going to be all the more difficult. So I think that's one dimension where we should be clear and not be too naive about one thing, which is the long-term steady state lifestyle that we want to have. And the second thing, which is how to finance the transition, because we have here a legacy. It's not that we start from zero and we write history from zero. We have to deal with that legacy and make sure that this legacy is dealt with as little as possible, disruption, inequalities, and all the implications for democracy that Darren was mentioning earlier. So I think that's one first thing, and which leads to the second thing I wanted to say, which is say, well, but growth, what is growth and on what is it based? And I think a lot of work that is being developed right now, not directly related to the macro analysis of growth, is work on what do we account for as value added. All the exercises that have been launched, that are being discussed regarding extra financial reporting, which is probably going to become extra financial accounting, will sort of say, we'll have to use another metric. We'll have to use another way to account for value added. And here a lot is possible. I mean, it's possible to think about growth in the same macro framework we've used so far, but having in mind different objects. And those different objects are, for one, externalities, and economists know quite well how to deal with, intellectually deal with externalities, but there are also things that we didn't want to account for in the first place. Not necessarily externalities, but biodiversity, for example. We didn't attach any value to it. Why not? It's a social, it's a collective choice that we have to make. And I think my fear is that we currently have all those debates involving heavyweights. The IFRS is spending a lot of money into defining the new accounting metrics. In Europe, there are people thinking about what kind of values put behind those new accounting rules for enterprises. But we should have in mind that this is a geopolitical debate, and it's almost ideological. And we have to be conscious of this and inject in that debate, which is way too much technical today, a little bit of thinking from other intellectual dimensions. So, and I have spoken about the accounting system for firms, companies, them being financial, not financial, but what about the accounting system for the state? And what about, in fine, the national account system? So it's a very, very deep statement, but at the end of the day, it will be very difficult to progress on the basis of the national account system that was set up after the Second World War, which has worked so well. So we'll have to make sure we don't disrupt everything, but we use this system to include a lot more than what we have included in it so far.
Thank you, Natasha. And of course, account systems is something we're going to address during the second panel this evening. Augustin Landier, I think it's probably time for you to build up on this concept of reviewing growth, maybe. You believe that the just transition will force us to take a close and maybe painful look at what we mean by growth and maybe review our values, both in the moral but also the financial sense. Are we going to have to review the concept of assets and maybe capital overall for this transition to happen?
So I really like the way you introduced the panel with these issues of trade-offs. So I think it's really important that we leave, in a sense, the marketing of the transition as something that is going to be win-win. The danger, and I think, in particular in France, we all have in mind the yellow jacket issues that were triggered by the carbon tax, is really to present things, as if, it's going to be win-win. Ultimately, it will pay for itself. We are going to create new champions, and, ultimately, we will be richer out of that. And I think people feel that, it doesn't feel, really reflecting reality. And that's what Gilles said. But basically, we need to be explicit about the cost, how we are going to share the cost. But we also need to investigate the moral preferences of the population. I think the danger is also to be convinced that, as economists or technocrats, politicians, central bankers, we know what is the common good. I don't think we know. I think the common good is something that, needs to be deliberated about. We need to find a consensus about what we are willing to prioritize. And so that's really, I think, a key issue. And I think the recent elections are also a little bit about that, about this need to deliberate. People want to make sure that, we are going to make sacrifices, we are going to define priorities, but these are not defined by technocracy. They have to be really debated upon. And so I think that phase is really important. Then I think on the finance has a role to play clearly, and Darren said it very well. Like regulations are lagging. There are big free rider problems. The institutions that are supposed to make multilateralism function are dysfunctioning, and they are going to be slow. So clearly, finance has a role to play to find and to investigate a bit this, biggest common denominator of the middle classes, of the people who save. What are they willing to sacrifice? What are they willing to bet for their future? But here again, the danger is the win-win rhetoric of, we are going to invest in green stuff and this is going to make you richer, and on top of that, this will make the world better. And so here again, I think we need to embrace a bit more the idea that there might be trade-offs, that we need to think about, what is going to be the impact of an investment, not only in terms of, is it a good anticipation of future regulation, and therefore, it might deliver better returns, but there might be many situations where there is actually like a financial trade-off. And one example of that is, if you are a large company, you can divest dirty assets to improve your ESG ratings, and then you might be able to enter green indices. But it's clear that selling your dirty assets to, like private equity funds, for example, at the highest price is not the responsible action, right? You need to have a policy for, trying to make sure that they are not going to be exploited in a dirty manner, or even deciding to strand them yourself. And so I think we are not at this stage yet of becoming really transparent and explicit about, this kind of cost-benefit analysis, and also about the fact that there are priorities. And Ukraine has been a great enabler of that debate, in a sense, because it forces us to prioritize things and say, okay, what do we think? What is the priority? Are we willing to sacrifice, the carbon trajectory temporarily for other objectives because they reflect, the desires of the population?
Thank you, Augustin. That's a question for everyone here, really. Do you think that we educate people enough about the cost of the transition?
Can I back? Because we are talking a lot about the cost of the transition, but there is also the cost of inaction, not doing anything. And I think the challenge of the discussion is this one, because it's very difficult to measure the cost if we don't do anything. But I think we start to see, in concrete terms, what is the impact of, climate change, drought, and so forth. So not doing anything, I think, is not really a choice. And what is very difficult indeed is to make the trade-off explicit, and to be able, in the policy action, the day-to-day policy action and measures, to take this very long-term challenge into account and in a way, front-load them, be able to measure and to take the decision taking into account this cost of non-action also, because for insurance, for example, if we don't do anything, something wrong will happen also. So, and on the overall cost, I'm also very, very struck to see for example, on the electricity, what we were saying about the cost of renewable and so forth, this is huge changes. And I think the technological green hydrogen, for example, still very expensive, but I really believe that in a few years, so the balance of cost and benefits is also shifting quite quickly, I think.
Thank you. François, after you.
If I may have a word about that. I think that we lie to the public when we speak of transition. And I think that the word itself conveys a message of a transformation that would be costless, that would be completely smooth and absolutely spontaneous. And we need to tell the truth. It will not be smooth. There will be losers, there will be cost, and at some point it will be hardcore. And I think that we need to face the reality and we need to prepare for that. And in a way, the concept of transition itself is, I think, a deceiving concept in front of what is ahead of us. And I would rather speak of transformation rather than of transition. And we should not let people believe that this will be something spontaneous, because as you have said, there are a lot of vested interest whose interest it is that things do not change or change as slowly as possible. And I think that in that regard, we need to be absolutely transparent and candid with the people as to what it will imply. And I think that many have not yet realized what it would mean to actually achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And very often I hear, when I give public conferences, audiences saying, shouldn't we trust the younger generation, the youth, they know better than us, they will do a better job. Sure, I have absolute trust that they will do a better job than we do, but it will be too late.
Thank you very much. Now, Gilles Moec, in your position as chief economist at AXA, I just wanted to know if you could tell us a bit more about what you estimate the risk to global growth of the green transition to be.
I can't give you a round figure. I'm sorry, there are tons of institutions coming with different assessments. I think we should try to distinguish two things. The short-term cost of the sort of sudden burst that you were basically referring to, and the sort of long-term course. As you said, transition implies a sort of very, very nice, harmonious, gradual path and transformation. It's unlikely to work like this. There will be bursts, and there will be moments when you will have, for instance, big inflation shock, or massive disruption to supply lines, or a situation where a big chunk of installed capital is going to be stranded. In those cases, you will have negative growth. You will have moments of contraction. It's probably unavoidable. Now, on the long term, it's probably fair to say that no matter how much investment we put in the system, there is probably still a marginal cost to take into account. But as Odile said, and it's a very complicated message to pass, we need to make this long-term cost, hopefully manageable cost, comparable, or to be more precise, we need to make people aware of the cost of inaction, and the cost of inaction is much worse. I remember 10 years ago, we all used the same quantifications, usually came from Nordhaus, and the idea was, yeah, after 40, 50 years, maybe you lose 0.5% of GDP per head, and you can think, oh, okay, it's probably manageable. It's not, because there's an old batch of new quantifications that tell you that it's non-linear. At some point, for instance, if you reach a level of warming in the oceans, the entire fishing stock disappears. You've got an entire industry which is fishing, which becomes completely obsolete. And the loss to growth, the loss to installed capital becomes absolutely monstrous. So it's probably a cost, but we need to be increasingly clear as to the catastrophic cost of inaction.
Thank you. Augusta, would you like to follow up on
maybe
this?
Just a word on that to push back a little bit. So I think the danger of emphasizing the cost of inaction is to miss the point that people are not naive. They are totally aware of the free rider problem, and they are totally aware that making efforts alone, as a country or as a bloc, is not going to be useful. A little bit useful because you produce technologies that might be used by others, that's true. But that's an indirect effect, and so there is a lot of leakage. And so I think people are fully aware of that, and the danger, again, is to not explicit the free rider problem and to say, look, we don't have a choice because, if we do nothing, things collapse. But the problem is that even if we do something and the others don't, things collapse. And people are totally aware of that. They are actually quite sophisticated, I think, more than what politicians and technocrats typically assume.
We've talked about finance and cost a lot here, but there's something that maybe we have not addressed enough, and it's time. The IPCC report actually insists on the importance of acting now. There's a sense of urgency to slash carbon emissions. But as we know, investment cycles in the green transition are long. We're talking decades, okay, to build new plants. So how do we address both the need for action now with this paradigm? Maybe that's a question for you, actually, Odile Renaud-Bassot.
I mean, decades, maybe you push a bit the time frame. I mean, it's long, but it's not decade. I think, as I was saying, I think in a way what's going on now on the prices of oil, gas, and so forth will create a big push when you see the discussion on how to accelerate dramatically renewable projects in Europe with, alleviating all the administrative issues which are, to find the ground, and also which takes 3-4 years. So that could be, because there is now, I mean, we are in a situation, I think, currently, where with the prices, have a extremely powerful carbon tax acting now. So I think the emergency of the current situation will have a huge impact on the acceleration of the project. Otherwise, I think the limitation indeed is not so much investment. The experience we have is that the limitation is not so much the financing, because when you have good projects with good legal framework and so forth, you find the money, you have a lot of investors willing to invest in green assets. So, but it's much more the policy capacity to go against the vested interest, to define and to implement, I mean, to go for the implementation of finding the grants, having the local population accepting, and so forth. So I think that these are the main obstacles today.
Thank you. Something more controversial, maybe. Not everyone, including people who work in sustainable investment, thinks that climate change is a financial risk, or at least a systemic financial risk, and they would rather favor adaptation. Are there any merits to this way of thinking? Gilles.
Honestly, I really think it's a fringe opinion now. If there's something which has moved a lot in the last maybe 5 years, is the level of conviction of the absolute need to fight climate change for self-interest reason in the corporate world. 5-10 years ago, you could have conversations actually with some corporates, with some financial actors, and it was still a debate. I'm actually not absolutely convinced, but I'm sure maybe there is a scientific mistake there. It's over. There's first, let's say, climate change denial is extraordinarily fringe. Then on the financial risk, again, non-linearities. I mean, it's one thing to say, it might be manageable to deal with a reduction in GDP per head by 0.2, 0.3 per year. The problem is that it's not going to be evenly distributed. And if you happen to be invested in a sector, an industry which becomes obsolete because, for instance, the price of carbon rises above a certain level, you've lost. You haven't lost 5 or 10%, you've lost everything. Stranded assets, for me, is the best way to fight what remains of, let's say, climate change denial.
We've got a few more minutes, just 2 actually before the end of this panel, but Natasha, I'd like to hear from you on this topic.
It raises, I agree with Gilles in saying things have evolved, but then it raises the question, which relates a bit to what Darren was saying, which is the strongest incentive for things to change? One incentive comes from regulation, constraints, laws, and the other incentive is the price incentive. So unless we have, as many incentives as possible in place, there will always be people maybe not pretending they agree with the adaptation principle, behaving as if they thought that were sustainable. So I think, in a sense, we should look at those views more as expressions of rational responses to incentives that are there or not there yet. And I think if we look at it that way, and we make sure that those incentives, them being legal or being in the price through additional taxes or something, then things will move naturally towards converge to what is still becoming the majority view right now.
Natasha, one more very quickly, because we're running out of time.
Just to say that, yes, a few years ago, there was still the debate as to whether we should mitigate greenhouse gas emissions or adapt to the impacts. And some would say, well, we still have time to adapt to the impacts. Now we realize that it's not a matter of choosing one or the other, and that we will need to do both. That we are also impacted by the consequences of climate change, and that it's not about choosing between mitigating or adapting, that we need to do both. And the situation is so dire that we do not have the luxury to choose also between instruments. We need to activate every possible tool and every possible instrument that can be used, be it regulatory frameworks or price signals, for example. I think that the era of choosing is over.
Thank you very much, François. And thanks to all of you, of course. You'll agree that it was the first panel that was very successful. Thank you.